In early June, the leaders of the G7, a group of the world's richest countries formed by the United States, Japan, Germany, the United Kingdom, France, Italy, and Canada, held a meeting led by the United States with the aim of seeking agreements to implement a global minimum tax. With this, multinationals would no longer have incentives to relocate or establish headquarters in countries with lower tax rates. And in fact, after the meetings, the finance ministers of these countries reached an agreement to establish a global minimum tax of at least 15%. So the questions are these. Will this end tax havens? What is the real US objective with this tax? And why is it going to be so difficult for some countries to actually implement it? If it is finally agreed among a wider group of countries to apply a global 15% tax, each country would have the right to top up the tax to 15%. For example, if a US multinational makes profits in Hungary, where the corporate tax rate is 9%, the US could charge an additional 6% to this multinational to make up the agreed 15%. Although this measure hurts multinationals that make profits in tax havens or in countries where taxes are relatively low, it would be difficult to eliminate tax havens, simply because a company will still choose to pay 15% if it makes profits in the Bahamas than to pay 21% in the United States or 28% in Germany. According to the OECD, countries are recovering between $50 and $80 billion. This may seem like a very large figure, but compared to the $6 trillion in annual profits of multinationals, it only represents about 1%. So, if multinationals are not prevented from continuing to prefer low-tax countries, and the money that rich countries would recover is representative, what is the real objective of the United States leading this global tax? Actually, there would be two objectives. The first one is to avoid, according to the G7 countries, an increased tax competition between countries that leads them to reduce taxes more and more to attract investments and companies. And obviously, in 1985, the global average corporate tax was 49%, in 2018 it was 24%. It is this tax competition that the United States wants to avoid by imposing a minimum of 15%. And the second objective would be for the rest of the world to adapt to its domestic needs. As is well known, the United States has a large fiscal deficit, and consequently its indebtedness has exceeded 100% of its GDP. In addition, the current administration wants to implement a plan to modernize the country's infrastructure with at least $1.2 trillion. For these reasons, it needs more resources to finance these investments, and part of these resources would come from an increase in the corporate tax rate in the United States from the current 21% to 28%. This increase would put US companies at a disadvantage, and some would be incentivized to relocate their operations overseas. This is why the US has led the way on this global tax, because if multinationals are taxed at 15% regardless of the country, they would be less motivated to leave the country than if they were taxed at 0%, 9% or 12% as they are today. In short, the United States needs this global tax for the rest of the world to more confidently increase its domestic taxes from 21% to 28%. But all this counting on the actual implementation of the global tax, since one thing is a verbal agreement between the G7 countries and another is to impose it widely. The G7 meeting is only a first step, then it would be a matter of negotiating with a larger group such as the G20 and the OECD, an organization of the richest countries in the world. But neither the OECD nor the G20 are legislative bodies, so all they can do is make recommendations to their members. For this reason, even if an agreement is reached, it would be necessary for each country to implement it and change its laws. Some countries may face internal opposition to these policies. On the other hand, the problem that many developing countries do not participate in these meetings, and it is difficult for their interests to be reflected, would have to be resolved. Opposition from low-tax countries such as Ireland, which has a corporate tax rate of 12.5%, and Hungary, which has a corporate tax rate of 9%, would also have to be resolved. In summary, as with any multilateral treaty, there are risks and obstacles to full compliance. For example, in 2020, an agreement was signed between the United States and China to put an end to the trade war between the two countries. Even so, both parties have not yet complied with all that was agreed. Another example is OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. It turns out that a few years ago it decided to invite Russia in order to increase its influence on world oil policy. In early 2020, the price of oil was very low, which is why, in March 2020, they met to agree to cut production and reduce oversupply to try to support the price. This seemed to benefit all members except Russia, the world's third largest oil country, which refused to make cuts. Russia's goal was to support low prices, break other producers with higher production costs and gain more market share at those low prices. From these two examples, it could be deduced that something similar could happen with global minimum tax agreements. Some countries might say they agree to avoid diplomatic pressure, but in reality they would not apply it or would find a way to evade it legally. Ireland has already spoken out against such a global tax on the grounds that it would benefit only certain economies. Switzerland stated that it will take the necessary steps to remain a very attractive business location, and the Netherlands, despite having a corporate tax rate of 25%, has multiple tax treaties with other countries that allow multinationals, in one way or another, to find ways to legally avoid high taxes. Not to mention China, which would seek to protect its low-tax special economic zones to attract investment. This indicates that each country is different, with its own particular interests and its own advantages, which each country should be able to use to compete with other countries. In other words, each country should be able to exercise its sovereignty and the right to implement its policies without pressure from other countries. If we look at Ireland, for example, it is a country that has used low taxes to make itself more attractive for investment, which is valid and legitimate, especially for a small peripheral economy. Ireland was a poor country by European standards, but thanks to certain policies it managed to become a rich country in a few years. Ireland is a country with no natural resources and dependent at that time on livestock and agriculture. After implementing harsh policies of spending restraint and openness to free trade, it managed to attract companies, especially US multinationals. Its economic policies included the reduction of corporate taxes. In addition, the English language and a skilled workforce led companies such as Apple, Facebook, Amazon, Google, or IBM to set up their headquarters in this European country. Today it is one of the countries with the highest per capita income in the world, and its inhabitants enjoy an excellent quality of life. And contrary to the widespread notion that cutting taxes leads to less government revenue, the case of Ireland in particular may be showing otherwise. Starting in 1996, Ireland began to reduce corporate income tax from 35% to 12.5% in 2004. And it was since the early 2000s that government tax revenues increased significantly. This does not necessarily mean a cause and effect relationship, but there is a correlation. Ultimately, the point is that there are countries without a large domestic market and without natural resources that have to find ways to compete internationally. For example, Estonia uses technology and a favorable tax framework to compete. The Netherlands takes advantage of its Central European location to trade, and Ireland uses its low taxes and language to be the gateway for US companies to Europe. The G7, on the other hand, are obviously countries with large economies, strong industries, larger populations and, in some cases, abundant natural resources. Therefore, they have more options when it comes to raising revenue. So any agreement that comes out of these meetings is far from being implemented in reality, because it depends on the rest of the world with its particularities and interests. Should tax havens disappear worldwide? Is it desirable for world powers to be able to influence the tax policy of other countries? You can leave your opinion in the comments.